On today's World Insight, U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo calls on the U.S. to confront China. Are decades of political and economic ties at risk of breaking apart? And China and the UAE have launched missions to Mars, with the U.S. soon to follow. Is a space race on the horizon? Here is our host, Tian Wei.
Hello and welcome to World Insight. I'm Tian Wei in Beijing. Distrust and verify, that is the rhetoric, a startling line from the U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo's speech about China last Thursday. Pompeo advocates discontinuing so-called blind engagement with China. He said the free world must change China or China will surely change us. That's at least according to his rhetoric. With U.S. President Donald Trump tailing badly in the polls as the election nears, his national security team has intensified their attacks on China in recent weeks. Is Pompeo's speech a declaration of a new Cold War against China? How much credibility does he have as a diplomat? Will some administration officials push the bilateral relations toward a point of no return? Let's loop in our panelists from both sides. For China-U.S. ties, we have in Beijing Da Wei, Assistant President and Professor from University of International Relations. In Washington, D.C., Michael O'Hanlon, Senior Fellow and Director of Research for Foreign Policy at the Brookings Institution. Gentlemen, welcome to the program. We have seen dramatic changes, apparently, of the relations over the past few weeks. Now, Professor Da, what do you make of the speech given by the Secretary of State in front of the Nixon Library, supposedly changing the U.S. approach to China?
I think we strongly disagree with what Secretary Pompeo said in the speech. I think the engagement strategy that the U.S. adopted in past several decades benefited to both countries, and both countries, I think, benefited a lot from that strategy. And of course, time has changed, environment has changed. I agree that maybe the engagement strategy should be changed or should be adjusted, but it should not be changed into confrontation or hostile competition strategy, which I think, Pompeo implied in his speech.
Is it strategic or is it tactic?
There's both, because in a way Secretary Pompeo is reflecting the shifts in American thinking that go back at least to the Obama administration, perhaps even to some extent to the Bush administration, when the United States became concerned that China's growing power would allow it to threaten the international order more than before. And also when the United States became concerned that China was not playing by the rules of the international economic order on matters like trade and protection of intellectual property. So in one sense, Pompeo's speech is no huge surprise, and obviously Vice President Pence had given similar speeches in the past. And so just because you hear it now from the Secretary of State doesn't necessarily mean it's brand new, because we had heard this from the Vice President before. On the other hand, we know the Trump administration is an unusual administration in the United States. Many of us in the foreign policy community find it to be not reflective of most American foreign policy thinking and worrisome in some of the approaches that it takes. And we also sense that the Trump team is trying very hard to create some big changes that might endure even if Trump loses the election in November, to make such big changes that they are hard to reverse for President Biden or anyone else. So I think part of the tone is new and special to the Trump administration, and therefore tactical and political. But part of it does reflect, as the professor said, a shift in American thinking that is quite bipartisan.
These are numbers out of many numbers in terms of describing what the bilateral relations has been about since the establishment of diplomatic ties. According to the latest Institute of International Education Statistics, in the academic year 2018 to 2019, there were nearly 1.1 million international students in the U.S. Colleges and universities. Nearly 370,000 of them were Chinese. On the other hand, the number of American students in China totaled about 11,600 as of year 2018, and this is 1 year only we are talking about. There are so many different layers of relations, from diplomatic relations, political relations, strategic relations, geopolitical relations, to economic and trade relations, to academic and also exchanges, people-to-people relations, person-to-person relations. Now, what quality does the Secretary of State, Mr. Pompeo, who is not respected either in the United States, in the diplomatic circle, here in China either, to have the guts to say, let's change the policy? Who empowered him to scrap off a relationship that has been established for 40 years with contributions from both sides for generations?
There is a wide accepted consensus maybe in the United States, basically arguing that the old China strategy, old China policy need to be changed. Does that mean to close the consulate, cut the, or even hurt the diplomatic relations? Does that mean to impose tariff, to hurt the economic trade ties? Does that mean to arrest scholars and revoke visas, then to harm the people-to-people exchanges? I don't think my American colleagues all agree with that measures they are taking. We can debate, we can discuss what a new strategy we should have to each other. But I'm quite sure it's not the policy that they are taking now.
Mr. O'Hanlon, what if the Trump administration's goal is to push the China-U.S. relations to an extent that there's no way to come back anymore, even after a new administration comes into power?
Well, I'd say two things. First of all, on the American side, we have an election, as you know, in less than 4 months. And this will be one of the most important elections in my lifetime because the perspectives of the two candidates are extremely different on many issues, including on America's role in the world and the U.S.-China relationship. Now, if Trump manages to somehow win this election, it's going to make life more complicated for everyone, including many of us in the United States who will not be happy with that outcome. But I think right now we need to bear in mind that, you know, it's only 3.5 months until Election Day. And we should not get too concerned about the closing of a consulate or other actions like that that are easily fixed. So I worry much more about issues like the use of force, potential for military crisis. Those can lead to issues and dilemmas that cannot be easily repaired. But second, if China were going to try to resolve or at least to mitigate some of these problems, I actually think there is one big thing that China can and should do right now, which is to clarify that its intentions about the South China Sea and the East China Sea are not to impose Chinese sovereignty over all of the waters and not to use force against the interests of other countries. Yes, it will pursue Chinese interests. No, I have to finish this point because if you really want to improve U.S.-China relations, you're going to have to sometimes hear something from American colleagues you don't enjoy hearing. But China's views on the South China Sea have actually reinforced the concern in the United States in both Democratic and Republican circles that China is becoming much more aggressive because it's becoming more powerful. And if that perception continues, even a President Biden will not be able to easily change the situation. So China has an opportunity to rethink and rediscuss, reportray its views on the South China Sea and the East China Sea, and no longer talk about these areas being vital Chinese interests where China has a sovereign right to control not only territories, but even big bodies of water. That is a very big opportunity for China to make this better, too.
Okay. You said there are 3.5 months, but we have seen over the past 2 to 3 weeks how many things have happened overnight. And my American friend have been telling me an American proverb, which is called, "A week is too long." So from a week to 3.5 months, there are a lot of time that we're talking about here. Once again, my question is very clear. Who will ring in this China-U.S. relations, one of the most important bilateral relations?
I think you're right, and I would say I'm very proud at Brookings to have two colleagues, Chung Lee and David Dollar, who think a lot like you said, and are aware of the kinds of communities in China, including, by the way, both of you, who I'm honored to be with on the show tonight, who want to see if there are ways we can sometimes disagree, but still collaborate and still find ways to minimize our differences and certainly not let them result in all-out adversarial competition or conflict. And so I appreciate that in the spirit of this show and what many of you have said and what Chung Lee and David Dollar and also Ryan Hass are trying to do with Brookings. I'm very proud to have these colleagues who are trying to find a new way forward on a different kind of U.S.-China relationship that nonetheless preserves cooperation where possible and minimizes the risks of danger. There are some times where Americans or Chinese feel they should always be defending their own government on a foreign show because you should leave your differences with your fellow Americans aside when you're talking to a foreign audience. No, I will criticize President Trump. I don't think he is a fair-minded president. I think he has some legitimate concerns about Chinese behavior, but the way he pursues those concerns, to my mind, are not always productive, not always thoughtful, and I hope very much that he will not be our president next year. And I think it'll make U.S.-China relations still quite difficult, but much more promising if, in fact, there is a different administration. Because President Trump can be very, very spontaneous. He can be very, very impulsive. He can be emotional, and it's not very healthy for the relationship with the two greatest economies and militaries on earth.
Professor Da, you've been listening to my talk with your colleague. Tell me more about, first of all, how would you respond to your colleague about the South China Sea, East China Sea issue? Secondly, your analysis of what exactly is going on. Can the water, once poured out, be taken back?
Yeah, on the South China Sea issue, I think this, of course, I think we all agree that this is a complicated issue. And I think the issue that Michael mentioned, like the sovereignty issue, the disputed features, I think that should be solved by China and other claimants as soon as possible. I think I agree with Michael that the clearer position of China and also other countries will be helpful for everyone. So, but this is very complicated. I really doubt that we can have the time to solve it before the election or maybe sometimes next year. I think that's very difficult. But again, I agree with him that this is something, a factor that is have negative impact on China's image in the U.S. and in the world. And back to the China-U.S. relations, one thing I want to maybe echo what Michael said is he criticized the Trump administration's policy. While I have something to say about China, I think, yeah, we all feel very angry about some policies that the administration has taken. But I hope that we can, particularly for the China side, to be calm, because as he said, we only have 100 days before the election, and I don't want to see vicious cycle caused by Trump administration. I think that will be for his benefit, for his domestic political purpose. Of course, when you see something like the closure of the consulate, you have to have some reaction. I think that's, of course, that's natural, that's necessary. But I hope our response can be limited. We don't need to step into tit for tat. I think that's not very good for everyone. So we will back to some more normal situation, but it will not like rolling back to the Obama era. I think that's impossible. So we shouldn't have this kind of unrealistic expectation.
The engagement policy, who should have the right to assess whether it is a success or not? What does diplomacy mean in a relationship that could be more hostile than engagement?
I think yesterday in the New York Times there was an article about how the United States consensus has shifted dramatically on China policy and how this has become bipartisan. And I retweeted that article, but I said the authors of the New York Times piece sort of forget that a few prominent Democrats, Kurt Campbell, Jake Sullivan, Jim Steinberg, Ryan Hass, have actually argued for a U.S.-China relationship that remains as collaborative as possible, that at least stays calm, that tries to keep our disagreements within certain parameters. And in fact, the Democrats and the Trump administration do not agree fundamentally. The Trump administration has gotten to the point where it sort of just wants to, in many ways, upset the entire apple cart. And many Democrats and moderate Republicans feel that we need a new relationship, as the professor has said, a new philosophy, a new strategy, but it needs to recognize that there are no more important countries on earth than China and the United States for collaborating on issues ranging from global warming to environmental preservation to stimulating the global economy. And let me also say that most Americans right now may be a little bit frustrated with certain aspects of the U.S.-China relationship and Chinese behavior, but this is not a deep-rooted feeling right now. We are much more concerned about our economy. We are much more concerned about COVID-19.
Yes.
We're not interested in demonizing China, and I think that people are interested in finding a new normal in the U.S.-China relationship, if possible.
On the U.S. side, I think those Republicans who opened the door to China, who broke the ice, like past President Nixon, they can assess the engagement strategy. By that engagement, I think China and the U.S. work together. We change the history. We end the Cold War. And for those Democrats, I think people like President Clinton and others, I think they can assess this strategy. But with that strategy, China and the U.S. work together, deepen the globalization. And both countries, both China and the U.S., benefited a lot from this globalization. The U.S. Customers enjoy cheaper products from China. They enjoy a higher international status supported by China. And the Chinese people, of course, benefit from the economic ties with the U.S. And also, like Tianwei, you mentioned, young Chinese students, yes, they studied in the U.S., they lived in the U.S., they learned a lot from the U.S. I think all those people can assess the engagement strategy rather than Secretary Pompeo. I'm very sorry to say that.
Well said, both of you. Thank you so much, gentlemen. Always, this is a platform for discussion, and I really appreciate from your frank insights. Thank you so much, Michael O'Hannon, Da Wei. Thank you, gentlemen. Stay tuned. You're watching World Insight with me, Tian Wei. We'll be back with more discussions about the trade and economic ties between China and U.S. at this critical juncture. Trade negotiators from China and the U.S. are expected to hold formal talks later this year to assess the status of their interim trade deal amid the backdrop of rising tensions. Under the general terms of the deal, which was designed and signed on January the 15th and took effect a month later, top-level talks should be held every 6 months. But Trump shut the door on phase 2 trade negotiations with China, saying he does not want to talk to Beijing about trade because of the coronavirus pandemic. Has the trade topic lost weight in the overall China-U.S. relationship, or could the trade deal provide a space of stability as bilateral ties sour? Let's invite our panelists from both sides. For China-U.S. ties in the perspective of economics and trade, we are joined by Professor Qian Jun, Executive Dean of the Fan Hai International School of Finance with Fudan University in Shanghai. In Florida, Jeffrey Schott, Senior Fellow on International Trade Policy and Economic Sanctions with the Peterson Institute for International Economics. Gentlemen, welcome to the program. May I start by asking Mr. Schott, with the bilateral relations almost as toxic in terms of atmosphere as described to me by an American people in the know about this relation. What can be the nature of trade and economic ties now between the two countries?
Well, I think we have to be very patient. Relations have deteriorated quite a bit. The Phase 1 trade deal is virtually a dead letter, and there's a growing mistrust in both capitals of each other. So I think we need to sit back a little and wait for the political situation in the United States to clarify after the election, and hopefully find a way to start rebuilding our relationship.
A test of patience described by Mr. Schott. Professor Chen, do you think that's also the sense that the Chinese have from this side of the world?
I agree that there's a lot of uncertainty coming from the side of the U.S., given the election coming up. So in terms of economic and trade relations, China's attitude should be engaging. China should not actively pursue decoupling. Of course, these trade relations are bilateral. If the other side must decouple, then we'll have to have a backup plan, if you will. But in terms of the U.S.-China relationship, from the Chinese side, economic and trade relations are very important to keep going. You could have diplomatic tensions, but economic integration, economic activities should not pause. But certainly, there is this wait-and-see attitude in terms of the uncertainty to be resolved in the U.S.
On the trade and economic ties, we have been hearing from international news coverage suggesting that there are still communications between the two sides about Phase 1 implementations, and also about even the prospect of Phase 2, even though hard at this point. Mr. Schott, do you think that the ties between the two sides in this regard can be maintained?
Well, certainly there is going to be further harsh rhetoric as we get closer to the U.S. election. And there's going to be continued friction, not just on trade relations, but on investment, on immigration issues, and that is actually more serious in my view. The restrictions placed on investment and exchange of technology, and the interruption or the disruption of the flow of people between our two countries, particularly to universities. That's going to continue. I think both sides have an interest in maintaining commercial relationships, and I think the Trump administration will seek to have a continuation of the increased purchases by China of U.S. farm and other goods. I think, as I said before, that the targets that were set in the Phase 1 deal are unrealistic, but there can be a significant increase in trade that will benefit both our countries.
Professor Chen, do you think the Phase 1 can still be implemented with minor adjustment, as Professor Schott just mentioned?
Certainly, there are going to be difficulties, but I think with some adjustment, the Phase 1 deal can be implemented. And let me emphasize, the key really is not to interrupt the relations. Again, economic activities, bilateral trade relations are very important in a period of economic crisis. As we learned from more than 100 years ago during the Great Depression in the 1920s and 30s, an important lesson, that crisis was so deep and prolonged precisely because countries, major economies, rather than break down trade barriers, they erected barriers. So the commitment of both sides to fulfill the trade agreement is very important. I agree with Mr. Schott that there are a lot of difficulties, especially in relation with technology. But commercial activities, including Chinese side buying more U.S. agricultural products, that type of bilateral actions benefit both economies, and it should continue.
Mr. Schott, tell me more about how from a larger scale the policy and also zoom in to the current administration, this will work?
The focus of the next few months will be on what is needed to meet domestic political objectives of the administration. And so at this point, part of the campaign, frankly speaking, is China bashing. But it's actually taken on a slightly lower profile in the past few weeks as President Trump has focused more on domestic law and order issues to be a central theme of his campaign. I think what Ambassador Lighthizer and Secretary Pompeo need to do is maintain an open line of communication with their counterparts in Beijing and try to keep the process of engagement on the commercial relations and the fulfillment of the Phase 1 deal as much as possible. As Professor Xian said, they need to keep that in their view and try to keep that moving forward as much as they can.
Right.
Then what happens after the election will depend on the U.S. voters and whether we have a change or not in administration next year.
This is Mr. Schatz against the backdrop of the WTO is looking for its new head. Against the backdrop of TPP is still in the making process. RCEP, we have seen also, it is still in the process of making, but have to wait for geopolitics to settle the dust down. So a lot of things are going on. So how do you think can be the best scenario and the worst scenario?
I don't think you've set the possibilities or the likely scenarios in the clearest fashion. What we're seeing is whether there's going to be more engagement at the multilateral level or whether countries are going to continue to pursue their bilateral initiatives. The Trump administration has focused on bilateral initiatives, both in doing new trade deals and in exercising political leverage through trade measures bilaterally, as has occurred in the U.S.-China trade war. It has given less attention to the WTO. I think that has to change, and it's in the interest of both the United States and China to invest more heavily in rebuilding the multilateral process. I was in a meeting with the Chinese ambassador to the WTO last week, and he put it very well, Ambassador Chang. He said the new normal in U.S.-China relations is abnormal. And that is something hopefully will be short-term, but something we have to calculate as we look at the options available for promoting economic growth going forward the second half of this year and next year.
Good point. Professor Qian, your thought?
So I agree. If you watch what's been going on, WTO has had a lot of difficulties. One of which is that this sort of dispute resolution mechanism basically stopped. On the other hand, countries are pursuing these bilateral or regional trade agreements or trade zones. I think from China's perspective, or from all the other countries, I agree wholeheartedly. It's important to have a worldwide trade organization, that is the WTO. And on top of that, you could have bilateral or regional agreements to modify what's been the WTO agreements, especially for emerging economies and developing countries. They really need the WTO to work, especially, again, during this economic recovery in light of COVID-19. But from China's perspective, again, as we've been saying, China should and will engage in the WTO agreements. But from its own perspective, I teach finance. The first principle of finance is that you have to diversify risk. So if the WTO reforms have all sorts of difficulties, then it's also in the interest of China and other emerging countries to negotiate these regional agreements. But from the efficiency point of the whole world, it's important to have to reform the WTO, to have it work, to cover as many countries as possible, and then on top of that, you can have a second tier, which is the bilateral relations, to modify that, but not to overrule, right? And then for domestic China, China is pursuing a continuing opening policy, including financial services. But at the same time, these relations are bilateral. If the other side, or if some other countries just completely shut the door or just actively pursue decoupling, then you can't open, right?
And my final question for both of you, we talk about the strategy, we talk about the political situation, the general economic trade situation. There's one thing also that we need to talk about, which is all of this impact on people's lives, like real people we're talking about, both in the two countries.
I'm actually more concerned over the medium term about the disruptions to the flow of people. Both our countries have benefited enormously from the access of Chinese students to the United States, to learn about the United States, and to come home and be more informed and have a better Chinese policy as a result, and vice versa. The U.S. students coming to China and learning more about Chinese society, Chinese history and culture. I think it's enormously important that we have informed officials and representatives of our policymaking community that can understand the motivations, the priorities, and the many areas that we share similar values, despite our political differences. So this has been a major casualty of the past few months because of the interruptions on visa, not only because of the pandemic, but for security reasons, and we need to find a way of reviving the dialogue we had before. So we need to think about that, and that's why I'm always happy to be on your program, because I feel I'm learning more from you and your guests about China, and hopefully imparting or reciprocating with some understanding of the United States.
Absolutely. You're a great source for all of us to understand better about what's going on in your part of the world, and also the logic going on there and the different intellectual views there as well. Thank you so much. And last word also from Professor Chen.
So I think there will be important variations across different sectors. If you look at the international companies in China, including the U.S. companies, I think going forward you will see that a lot of consumption-oriented industries will continue to blossom. You see that Disney in Shanghai is doing well. You see Starbucks, even Apple stores are doing well. Tesla in Shanghai. All these companies, businesses that are already on the ground, I think they'll continue to do well. Unfortunately, not for economic reason, but for political reason, there are other technology sectors. Unfortunately, we will see disruptions in the communications between these sectors. I agree wholeheartedly that the disruption in persons traveling to both countries is very unfortunate. So hopefully, once the pandemic slows down, under control, at least in these areas, that we can see a resume of bilateral relationships,
we hope that
including the people traveling to both sides.
We hope that will be the case. We also hope, not in the far future, the reasonable voices will prevail. Thank you so much for both of you, Chen Jun and Jeffrey Schott. Really appreciate it. Stay safe. Thank you. You're watching World Insight. Coming up on our program, China and the UAE have just launched missions to Mars, with the U.S. soon to follow later this year. Is a space race on the horizon, or international cooperation, in fact, could be the way out? Welcome back. You're watching World Insight. I'm Tian Wei. 2020 is an optimal year for Mars missions, given the close distance between Earth and Mars. On July the 23rd, the China National Space Administration launched its Tianwen-1, or Questions to Heaven, which carries the country's very first Mars rover and orbiter. It should arrive in orbit around the red planet in February. If the mission is successful, China will join the United States to become just the second country to operate a rover on the red planet. Last week, the UAE also launched its HOPE satellite towards Mars. And the U.S. Space Agency also aims to dispatch its next-generation rover, Perseverance. So why are humans going to Mars? And what is China's Mars mission all about? Will it signal a space race with the U.S., or actually it creates more opportunity for international cooperation? Let's invite our panelists. For Tianwen-1 Mars rover's mission, in Beijing, Yang Yuguang, professor at the China Aerospace Science and Industry Corporation. In Washington, D.C., Dr. Amitabh Ghosh, who is the chair of the Science Operations Working Group for the NASA's Mars Exploration Rover mission. Welcome to both of you. Dr. Ghosh, your input first, reaction to the success so far from the China mission.
So I think it's an incredible first step. So actually here, there is the chance of failure is when you reach Mars, when you land on Mars. So we'll keep our fingers crossed that that goes fine. But it's an so I have worked for multiple rover missions, and I can tell you it's an incredible journey. So think of, what is the loneliest road that you have ever traveled? Say you're driving in Alaska, there is a 500-mile road, and you meet a human being every 20 miles. Now imagine you're on Mars, and now that road, there is no human on that road. And worse and better still, there is no road. You're free to drive wherever you want. So this is the adventure you're starting on.
Professor Yang, as Dr. Ghosh just mentioned, the real test is when you landed on Mars, what's going to happen? And China is still a little bit far from there. What do you make of the prospect?
The most tough point, or the most dangerous part, is the entry, descending, and landing. For you see, we've already have a successful launch last week, and we are going to Mars. After 7 months, we'll have a very critical point, which is called the Mars orbit insertion. It is the first time that China do it. I hope it will be a complete success. But at that moment, the most dangerous part is the landing procedure. For you see, until now, only the United States have ever successfully landed on Martian surface and performed scientific research. So this is the first time we do it, and still uncertainty, risky, and probably we will have many great challenge on it.
Having said that, though, putting the romanticism aside, we are seeing also, apparently, outer space competition between China and the United States. For example, on the mission on Mars, of course, China is just starting. It's a different story. But still, are we seeing signs of former Soviet Union and the United States competing, the so-called Star Wars kind of competition? Dr. Ghosh?
So I would think so, because the conditions were different. So here you can think that the U.S. landed on Mars in 1976. So this is 45 years too late. Two is, if it is a prize, if there's a competition, if there's a space race, what is the prize here? The prize is just finding out more about the rocks and soil or the climate of Mars. It's nothing tangible or nothing economic. So see, it is very easy for the press to say competition, but you have to also remember it's just United States and China are not in the game. United Arab Emirates launched a mission just last week.
Yes.
Then the Europe is also in the game. Russia is in the game. Japan is in the game. So I think this is all advanced nations are looking at the most interesting of problems.
I'd love to believe in your description. Professor Yang, your perspective about that?
Well, I totally agree with Dr. Amitav Ghosh. You see that the United States is now plays a leading role in the Martian exploration. It already has at least 4 rovers roving on the Martian surface, and the only country which can perform scientific research on the Martian surface. And you see that every 2 years or every 4 years, the United States will have a Mars mission. Well, you see, in China, we have this Tianwen-1 mission, and in the future, we will have another sample return mission. So you see, we only have these 2 missions. We will not challenge the leading role of the United States. We developed this Mars mission just because we need it. We need to promote our high technology field, and we need to promote our national economy, and this kind of planetary research will give a better understanding of these kind of scientific research goals. And you see that as Dr. Amitav Ghosh have mentioned that all space capable nations have joined the research of Mars because, you know, these countries all think that it is their duty to do some contribution to the Martian research. So you see, it is the right time for China to do it, but we only planned 2 missions for the next 2 decades. So you see, we don't challenge any other country. And I emphasize again, it is meaningless for us to compete each other.
I remember, you know, watching movies related to Mars, and it was an interesting combination of Chinese investment and the Hollywood production. Fascinating. But now we are seeing that countries are working hard on Mars. Eventually, what are some of the immediate goals, do you think, Mr. Ghosh, as a result of this research?
Okay, the immediate goal is what is not in the story picture right now. So Elon Musk has a company called SpaceX, and they are trying to make a spaceship to go to Mars on a commercial basis with 400 passengers, so that the cost per ticket is about $200,000, or the cost of maybe an apartment in Beijing. So they are trying to make, so this is incredible. So, you know, if you ask anybody 20 years back, they would say it would take the GDP of a major country to go to Mars for one person. So Mars is becoming mainstream.
Okay, thank you so much for both of you joining us and helping us to understand better the missions of Mars from both countries. Yang Yuguang and Amitav Ghosh, thank you so much. All the best. And that is all we have for today. If you'd like to see more, try to search our program, World Insight, or check out our YouTube channel. Follow us on Twitter and Facebook. I'm Tian Wei. On behalf of the team, thanks for watching. Bye for now.